All right, Jen, by my clock, you're good to go. I know you can't necessarily see with the way your screen is pulled up.
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. All right, well, let's get started. At the very least, we're also recording. So thank you for anyone who's joining. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this G-Local Evaluation Week event. This is also part of 3IE's ongoing evidence dialogue series, our bi-monthly webinar series focused on evidence and insights on the effectiveness of approaches in international development. My name is Jen Sturdy. I'm a senior evaluation specialist here at 3IE. And for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. 3IE works closely with governments, development institutions, foundations, NGOs, and other partners working in low and middle income countries to address their decision-making needs and build up evidence systems to support those needs. So we support the production, synthesis, translation, and uptake of high quality development evidence across the globe and across sectors. As part of that work, we're also very committed to research transparency and reproducibility. We see efforts to make our evaluation work as transparent and reproducible as possible as part of a larger effort for ensuring the ethical conduct of our evaluation activities. So that's why we brought these three pillars together, and we're presenting our current work to strengthen systems for more transparent, reproducible, and ethical evidence, so TREE for short, through our TREE review framework. This session has three parts. We're going to go for about 90 minutes. Hopefully I don't talk for too long, so I'm going to try and keep the moderator overview of the framework and tools to about 30 minutes. And then we can go into our panel discussion with our four panelists. Then, after the panel discussion, we'll leave time for an open Q&A with the audience. So as you have questions, please feel free to send them in the chat, and we will moderate those when we reach the Q&A session. Before diving in, I want to introduce the four panelists. So I'm joined by Bidisha Barua, Lead Evaluation Specialist with 3IE and based in India. Chandan Jain, Evaluation Specialist with 3IE, based in India. And then Andrew Tangang, Research Fellow and Senior Policy Analyst with Effective Basic Services in Cameroon, as well as Charlotte Lane, Senior Evaluation Specialist with 3IE based in Washington, DC. And to help me with the panel, we are also joined by my colleague Shayak Katua, Evaluation Specialist with 3IE, and Shayak will be the one to help us moderate the Q&A. I do need to say, at any point, if there is a disruption to the webinar, such as someone tries to hack and disrupt our webinar, we will need to end it, and in which case we'll send you an email with follow-up. Hopefully that doesn't happen. And if you are on Twitter and you're interested in engaging there, you can tag at 3IE News, and also please use the hashtag GLocal2022 for any posts you may make about the session. Before going into a presentation, we wanted to have some fun and get to know the audience a little bit. So I'm curious how many audience members we have. But if you will open up a new browser or open up your phone and go to menti.com, MENTI.com, we want to ask a couple of questions about your experience with training, concerns, and practices around the ethical conduct of evaluation and research. So let me just pull up that Menti. So if you are at menti.com, you're going to enter 20475121. So that code is up at the top of my screen. And when you get there, the first question we have is just which country are you joining us from? So we're curious about where our audience and everyone who's joining is based in, just so we can get to know you a little bit. Okay, great. Someone from Norway, that's great. Yeah, and I know Cameroon needs to end up there, at least. We'll wait a couple more minutes, see if anyone else joins us. Okay. Our next question that we're interested in knowing is what best characterizes your current training on ethical conduct of research and evaluation. So this can be your standard training on protection of human subjects, or maybe other trainings that you've received. So we ask you to choose one option. Have you completed training within the last 3 years? Have you completed training more than 3 years ago and will renew soon? Have you completed training more than 3 years ago and you don't think you need to do more? Is this just not required for your job, or none of the above? Great to see. Oh, okay. All right. Now we have some variation. Okay, great. Okay, it's great to see a lot of training already occurring when it's applicable. Okay. Our next question is on a scale of 0, so not at all concerned, to 5, extremely concerned. How concerned are you regarding any of the following? So you should have a sliding scale of 0 to 5 for each of these options. The first one is p-hacking, or data mining, or selective reporting. These are more researcher or evaluator kind of owned practices that can affect the credibility of our work. Data manipulation or fraud, failure to reproduce analysis, ethics of the interventions we study, so any concerns regarding the ethics of interventions, concerns regarding the ethics of research methods we use, concerns regarding the ethics of how we engage directly with human subjects through our informed consent process, interview process, or other interactions. Concerns regarding the ethics of data management and sharing, concerns regarding health and safety of staff, or health and safety of participants. So thanks for entering. It looks like we have certainly more concerns from the group in failure to reproduce analysis, the potential ethics of interventions, and how we're engaging directly with our human subjects. So thank you for participating in that. Last question before we dive back into the presentation. So for your most recent study, so that could be the current study that you're leading or funding, or for the last one that you finished if you're not currently in a study, which practices do you implement or fund? So we have study registration, pre-analysis plans, standardized reporting templates, data use and sharing agreements, data de-identification, push-button replication or computational reproducibility, going through institutional review board, and independent ethics review, so maybe outside the IRB review, going to an independent ethics review, or none of the above. Okay, great. So it looks like we have certainly use of pre-analysis plans, standardized reporting templates, push-button replication, and submission to IRBs, and maybe less so in the other areas. Okay, so thanks for participating in that. And back to the presentation. So that's just getting to know, I think, you a little bit. Certainly at 3IE, I think we shared some of the concerns that are raised in that slide, and that's kind of what's driving our decision to establish the tree review framework. So I'll go over the why and what this is before heading into the panel discussion. So why do we think this tree review framework is potentially useful for our practices? I think it starts with our goal. So our goal is to resource evaluation practices that produce credible, unbiased, meaningful evidence in an ethical manner. And that's a tall order. And in order to kind of achieve that goal for every individual study or individual evidence product, there's a variety of risks that we face to achieving that goal. Threats to rigor, threats to credibility that have been called attention to in the social science credibility crisis, like publication bias, failures to replicate, p-hacking, selective reporting. We have threats to usability of the evidence we're producing. And through the interactions we study, interventions we study, and our study methods, there's the potential for threats to participants' staff, and bystanders. The good news is, I think, for any of us working in this space, we know that we have a lot of risk mitigation strategies to address these risks. There's a lot of best practices we know of, and we can integrate into our evaluation workflow. So for threats to rigor, this is our training on rigorous evaluation methods, attention to establishing a counterfactual when feasible, maintaining it as feasible alongside partners, investing in strong questionnaire design, sampling, data quality monitoring, really an emphasis on methods. For threats to credibility, this is where the open science movement has come in with renewed attention on data code sharing, reproducible workflow, pre-specification through registration and pre-analysis plans, use of standardized reporting to align with that pre-specification. So a long laundry list of best practices there. For threats to usability, we have many tools at our disposal. We can create evidence gap maps to identify where priority areas are and evidence is very much needed. We also are improving the way that we engage with stakeholders with an eye towards use and ensuring that we're engaging with stakeholders early and often to ensure evaluations are designed with end use in mind. And for threats to participants and bystanders, we certainly have well-established ethical principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice that we are trained on in our training, and certainly guide our work when we also submit to institutional review boards. And there have been more and more calls in the international development evaluation community to document and be more transparent about our ethical decision-making. So we have a lot of tools in our tool belt to respond to these risks. But at least within 3IE and over the last 6 months, we've seen 3 problems that we think we can address through an action like the tree review. So the first one is, that's a long laundry list of best practices. And doing this work is very complicated. And it's a lot of best practices and actions to incorporate into workflow and keep your eye on, from budgeting to dissemination and data and code sharing. So how do we establish stronger support systems to research teams, evaluation teams, to ensure that we are integrating these best practices into workflow? 3IE established a top-down policy related to transparency and reproducibility in 2018. It's been revised and expanded to include the tree agenda in 2021. But a policy alone, doesn't reach full implementation. So we think additional support systems are needed to support evaluation teams as they integrate all of these best practices into workflow and budgets. The second problem or challenge that we're dealing with is, in international development evaluation practice, we don't really have shared, actionable ethical standards and guidance for transparent, reproducible, and ethical evidence generation. I think a way to call attention to this is there were 3 papers that came out in early 2021, all within a month of each other. And all 3 were calling attention to the need for more ethical, more documentation and transparency around the ethical decision-making, particularly in RCTs. And I think a lot of the messaging from these papers could be applicable to other methodologies as well. But what was interesting was, even though all 3 were kind of addressing and talking about the same issue, so the ethical conduct of our work, there was alignment in some obvious areas where they called attention to. So certainly all 3 papers called attention to the need to mitigate potential harms from the intervention and the study methods. But across the papers, there were also unique topics that were raised, and each of them were valuable, I think. And so thinking about, how do we kind of create a more shared set of minimum ethical standards, so that when we're asked to be transparent about our ethical decision-making, we also know transparent about what. This is further confirmed. There's a recent analysis done at the end of 2021 to look at the ethical guidance across multiple evaluation associations, institutions, and organizations. And that analysis came to a similar conclusion. There's a lot of work and attention in evaluation organizations to ethical conduct. But that attention varies. There's variation in terminology, variation in focus of what areas to focus on for ethical conduct. So really, there's a need, I think, in our community for a little more attention to some shared actionable standards that take us one step below the high-level principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Our last problem that we are calling attention to is the existing ethics oversight is often insufficient. We do submit to institutional review boards for review. IRBs are built to review protocols for alignment with regulations, and those regulations, certainly if they are mirroring the regulations of the US, are primarily built for clinical medical research, which social science has built off of that system, and evaluations have built off of how social science has built off of that system. So we're working within a system that isn't necessarily built to be reflective of this, some unique kind of ethical dilemmas that can be faced in evaluation work. Aside from that, within the IRB system, we're not always clear on what level of review we will get. Is it a full, an expedited, or an exempt review? In some situations, a program evaluation, even when it is collecting PII and sensitive data from human subjects, can be put in the exempt category because it doesn't meet the definition of research according to regulations. In addition, there's huge variation across IRB quality and quality regulation, I think, of IRBs. There's HHS registered, there's accredited IRBs, there are IRBs that don't have either. And even when an IRB is HHS registered, there's a big disclaimer that says, but this doesn't mean that there's a quality assurance in place that HHS can vouch for that IRB. So there's variation in terms of the potential quality of IRBs, and probably some IRBs are outstanding and some IRBs are not necessarily giving a full review or what we expect from an IRB review. The last point here is IRBs are not reviewing protocols for best practices in transparency and reproducibility, which means that when we're submitting research protocols to an IRB, we're not really getting a full review of all of the actions we are taking to ensure ethical conduct of our work. Okay, maybe we have a few more members. We're going to take one quick break and zip back over to the Mentimeter, because I'm curious about your experience with IRBs and concerns you have within your work. So let me go back to presenting. So for your most recent study, what best characterizes your experience with an IRB? So we choose one. Did you receive full review and clearance? Did you receive expedited review and clearance? Did you receive exempt review and clearance? Did you receive clearance, but you're not sure of the level that you actually received? Did the IRB not clear on the study? Did you not submit for IRB review? This is not required for your job. And it's also an okay answer to respond, what is an IRB? Okay, an IRB did not clear on the study and not sure of the level of review. Yep. I've certainly been in situations where we worked with an evaluation team, submitted to the IRB, and then didn't find out that actually it was an exempt review until well past implementation. An exempt review actually means that the informed consent wasn't even reviewed by the IRB. So it's interesting to kind of examine what level of reviews we're actually getting when we submit our protocols. Thank you for participating. It's interesting to see. Okay, this one is a gamble with few audience members, but for your most recent study, provide up to 5 keywords that characterize ethical concerns you had. So anything we've talked about previously, but specifics can include concerns regarding the informed consent process, payments to participants and how and when to manage those, maybe the burden of the survey and how long is too long of a survey. But I'm curious what keywords might represent any concerns you had going into kind of your study and approaching the IRB review. Risk to beneficiaries, potential for negative results. To the call and joining after we kind of gave directions. We're at menti.com, menti.com. And if you put in the code 20475121, we'd love to have you participate as well in these little mini surveys to kind of learn about the audience. Livelihood loss, true consent, I think really, is it really informed? A couple more, see if anyone else is joining in this poll. Yeah, informed consent is a big one. Okay, I'm going to head over. Last question. For your most recent study, did the IRB support you to navigate these ethical concerns? So did you actually feel that the IRB fully responded or supported you in the concerns you had? Please select one. So yes, the IRB fully supported you on these issues. The IRB supported on some issues, but not others. No, the IRB did not support me on these issues or not applicable. And that's probably for those of you who did not submit to an IRB. IRB supported on some issues, but not others. So certainly our data is reflecting some of our shared concerns. Take us back to the presentation. These three problems that we're raising kind of continue to pose a potential for risks, right? Risks to participants, bystanders, staff, and funders as well. And these risks are the potential for harm, the health and safety and welfare of participants, bystanders, and staff, and the potential reputational risk that's posed to staff and funders if they're viewed as not actually conducting their evaluation in an ethical manner. So first we need to define what is that? What is the ethical standards and ethical manner that we abide by? Again, we certainly have our high-level principles of beneficence, respect for persons, and justice. But I think what we're seeing is sometimes a need for more actionable, granular minimum standards. So that's what we are hoping to achieve with the tree review framework. Tip the scales in favor of having stronger responses in our tool belt to respond to risks. So what is the tree review framework? The big picture is we want to establish standards to ask the right questions at the right times, even if there aren't easy or right answers. And we want to create a supportive peer review function, not a policing or auditing function. So as we worked, this has been about a 6-7 month process so far for us. And as we worked to think through what we would propose for within the 3IE space as the minimum standards for asking the right questions, there's a growing and rich literature that's being built around examining clinical research ethics and how that may be adapted and applicable for public policy research and the sort of questions and ethical dilemmas we deal with in our work that is unique and different from clinical research ethics. I think there's also several papers that have come out in the last year or so that really, papers and a book, Ethics for Evaluation, that have come out that really are calling attention to the unique ethical challenges of evaluations as tools for value judgment and decision making. And so this literature has really helped to inform how we've shaped the sort of questions we think we should be asking ourselves. And I think this goes without saying, we're looking to complement the work we need to do with IRBs, maybe use a tool like this to maximize how we engage with IRBs and work toward more meaningful engagement with IRBs, and to complement that work through a supportive peer review function. So the goal of the framework is the same goal we start with, which is to resource evaluation practices that produce credible, unbiased, meaningful evidence in an ethical manner. Our objectives with the tree review framework have been to establish those ethical standards, better integrate tree best practices into evaluation workflow, and establish timely, continuous, independent review of risks facing the evaluation team to meet that goal and the risk strategies they're putting in place to do so. To do that, the heart of the tree review is the tree review questionnaire, where we've defined those questions. We see this as a potentially useful tool to improve relevant documentation. So use the tool to kind of assess the protocol, the informed consent as is, preferably even before sending to the IRB, so that we are ready for what questions we may want to pose to the IRB. It's also a tool to help centralize a summary of all the relevant ethical decision making. So oftentimes how we are documenting the ethical decisions we're making, it can be across a variety of documents: research protocol, informed consent, field manuals, data management plan, et cetera. It can be many different documents. And so how do we create a way to track online? Shayak, if you don't mind grabbing that link and sending it in the chat, that could be helpful. But you're welcome to take a look. This is a, 6 months in, rough draft. We're trying to think through how best to also design it in a way that's very user-friendly. But just so you have a sense of what this tool looks like, we wanted to share it with the audience. In terms of milestones, we're thinking that a tree review process like this is best built into the evaluation lifecycle from beginning to end. So at the design stage, it can be used to inform initial protocols and certainly budget, as there are some budget implications for some of these activities. Things like data de-identification and push button replication. These are additional efforts that require time and resources to conduct before we're ready for data sharing, for example. As well as prior to data collection, so ensure our protocols are up to date and we feel risk is mitigated. And prior to final publication, mainly to see if a tool like this can support and facilitate production of a final ethics appendix, which is certainly called for from the Seydu Carlin paper that I flagged earlier that came out in 2021. With or without independent review, we think the tool and the process is helpful and can be, but we've also, as part of this pilot period, embedded an independent review. So the evaluation team actually fills in the questionnaire, and then a set of reviewers outside of the evaluation team reviews and assesses and provides feedback. So that's been the process we follow. I would not be very ethical if I didn't also share that many, many people have commented on this so far, and we're very grateful for the input as we've been building this out over the last 6 months, and we are very much welcoming of any additional input to continue building this tool. So before we dive into the panel, what are the 10 ethical standards that we're proposing underlie this framework? So use transparency as a tool. This is our first standard, where we, within the tool, kind of document all of the best practices across transparency and reproducibility that we're implementing. Maximize social value and meaningful use. So this starts with making sure we have a strong problem diagnostic and theory of change for the intervention that we're studying. We understand who our evidence consumers are and their motivation for this activity, this evidence generation activity, and understand and assess any potentials across stakeholders for incentives for misuse, whether that's active or passively done. Balance power and align incentives. We may kind of work this one a little bit towards just understand power and align incentives. I mean, I think the power dynamics that can exist within evaluation teams, between evaluation teams and funders, between evaluation teams and stakeholders, between the field staff and the participants and potential bystanders of communities we're going in and entering. There's a variety of power dynamics that what we're trying to work toward is just making sure we understand them and we document them to help inform an understanding of individuals' vulnerabilities that may affect their risks in the study. The evaluation team's role in the intervention, so getting much clearer about when the evaluation team is actually responsible for implementing the intervention as well as evaluating it versus completely independent of that or somewhere in between, and any potential restrictions on reporting that are being placed on the evaluation team. The fourth is preserve standard of care. So this has us examining ex ante what might be the impact of the intervention on the standard of care that's delivered to the population that's being studied. Is there any potential for negative impact that we can understand ex ante that needs to be carefully assessed before proceeding? Is there any need for deception in the intervention or the study methods? If so, how are we managing that in an ethical manner? And what is the legality of the interventions we're studying and our study methods, making sure that we're understanding the legal landscape that we're working in. Fifth is to value and prioritize community engagement. So this starts with how are we ensuring strong representation from the population we're working with on the study design and implementation and dissemination. And of course, the study participant feedback loop. So how do we work toward improving this process of engaging more with our participant population on the results of the study, to engage them. So first of all, it's not an extractive exercise. They kind of understand what they're a part of, but also potentially getting their feedback and input on interpretation of results and seeing if that improves how meaningful our analysis is. 6 is use fair methods. So this is where a lot of attention has been paid to fair randomization. Because we work with a variety of methods, we wanted to expand this to just fair methods, regardless of if we're randomizing or not, we still want to be fair. And this gets into just understanding the state of equipoise, the state of scarcity, alignment of methods with intervention details, and attention to how we're ensuring data quality. 7th is ensure fair treatment of participants. So this is first alignment of the study participant selection with intervention selection. Are we creating any new rules for how the intervention is rolled out for the sole purpose of the evaluation? If so, are we understanding why and what that means? Or are we just leveraging the way the intervention is designed and rolled out on its own? How do we consider fairness to the control group? Unlike clinical research, a control group in our evaluations isn't necessarily guaranteed to receive the intervention if it's found to improve outcomes. And so how do we think about fairness to control groups when they bear the burden of our evaluations and the duration of long interviews, but not necessarily have any of the benefits of the intervention? And this is where we also examine the need for participant compensation based on burden of the survey. 8, 9, and 10 are pretty straightforward. So 8 is ensure informed consent and protection of confidentiality. 9 is ensure favorable risk-benefit ratio and accountability. And 10 is ensure favorable cost-benefit ratio and accountability. So this has 2 levels to it. First, are we right-sizing the evaluation? Are we ensuring that we aren't necessarily just going with the most expensive evaluation method because it's the fanciest or the most rigorous? Are we right-sizing it to needs and comparing it to other costs of methods that could be equally meaningful? But also, are we comparing the cost of the evaluation to the interventions we're studying and the intervention investment decisions? Because oftentimes that's what really places the cost of the evaluation in appropriate context, which is, it could be just a drop in the bucket in terms of the total amount that could be reinvested into that intervention we're studying. So that is the overview of the why and the what. Hopefully that's not too much detail, but just enough to get us started with our panel discussion. So what issues has the tree review raised? We have 4 great panelists to talk about their experience with the pilots that we've been conducting since January. And I will be really happy to turn it over to Chandan. Before I do, I'll just say we gave each of the panelists a few guiding questions. So what key risks were considered for your study before the tree review? What key risks were considered after the tree review? How did the tree review process support risk assessment and mitigation? How has the tree review process informed your approach for the next study? What challenges or gaps remain for navigating ethical decisions? Are the benefits worth the cost? Was this even worth it? And those were just suggested guiding questions, but really we're looking forward to hearing the experience of each of our 4 panelists. So Chandan, I think I'm ready to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jen. And hi, everyone. So my name is Chandan, and I'm an evaluation specialist at 3i. So I'm going to be speaking about the tree review within the context of an ongoing impact evaluation. So the impact evaluation that we basically conducted, the tree review pilot, where this called as the impact evaluation of the collective impact initiative. So before I sort of go into sharing the experience from the tree review process, let me just give you a background of the project itself. So the collective impact initiative is basically a multi-sectoral project, and it aims at improving lives of waste pickers, specifically informal waste pickers in urban Bangalore in India. Now, so this project is funded by H&M Foundation, and the idea of the project is to basically introduce or expose the participants or the beneficiaries, which are informal waste workers, to various different interventions at the same time, so as to basically improve their lives over time. Now, so 3i's role in this project is of an independent evaluator. And what I mean by independent evaluator is that as a participant in this project, we are not basically directly involved with basically how the intervention is designed or is delivered at the ground level, but our interaction with the community of waste pickers is basically happening at the time that we are basically conducting the baseline, which is right now ongoing, and also at the time that we will be basically going back to the population for doing the endline survey. So in terms of our engagement with this community of informal waste pickers in Bangalore, so our engagement is basically limited to the time that we are there in the field doing the baseline data collection and baseline the endline data collection. Now, in December 2021, when we had basically just initiated the baseline data collection, Jennifer and Shayak, who are part of the tree team at 3i, they basically approached us with the idea of basically doing this tree pilot for the collective impact initiative. And we basically went through the tree review. And I must say that the process did help us identify additional sort of risk that we hadn't sort of thought through at the time we were planning for the baseline survey, and at the time when we were basically designing the survey instrument as well. So it basically helped the research team to first think about these risks and also how to sort of mitigate those risks in a more structured manner. So that is like the macro sort of understanding or the macro sort of learning that we had from the tree review process. Now, in terms of the specific sort of guiding points that Jen was basically just sort of projecting in terms of what are the risks that were basically identified before we had basically done the review, and what are the risks that we had identified after we had basically gone through the review. So in terms of starting with the risks that we had basically considered before going in for the tree review process, and while at the time that we were basically planning for the baseline data collection. So one of the major thing that we had basically considered was comprehension of the informed consent, and as well as the duration of time that that the respondents would be spending in terms of answering to the survey instrument. So as I'd mentioned, that the survey and the program beneficiaries in this particular project are basically informal waste pickers in the city of Bangalore in India. So majority of this population is basically not literate and do not basically know or are not basically aware about the rights that they have as data providers or basically respondents to the survey, right? So what we were initially concerned was with the level of technicality that sort of exists in the informed consent, whether that would be basically, that is something, whether these respondents would be able to sort of comprehend or not. So what we sort of did around that was to basically do extensive pilot of the informed consent as well as the entire survey as well, just to sort of understand what is the level of comprehension and what are the sort of changes that we need to sort of make to the informed consent in order to make sure that people who are responding to the survey basically understand what are their rights and then only sort of decide to participate in the survey. So the pilot did help us to understand what are the changes that we need to make in the informed consent, and also how do we sort of integrate the local languages and sort of local sort of terms that are used in the region into the informed consent, and also sort of similarly make changes to the survey questionnaire as well. Now, the other thing that the pilot sort of helped us to understand was majorly around the duration of the survey. So our survey is pretty comprehensive, given that we have seven to eight different partners for which we are basically tracking multiple outcomes. So our survey is of around 2 hours of duration. So initially, before the pilot, we were hoping to do the survey with just one respondent, but based on the experience from the pilot, we had to actually sort of break the survey into two parts, wherein we are doing the first part with the household head and the second part with the spouse of the household head. So I guess piloting did help us understand what are the changes that we need to sort of make to both the informed consent as well as to the entire survey as well. So comprehension as well as the survey duration was the first sort of risk and the issue that we had sort of thought about when we were planning for the baseline survey. Now, in terms of the second risk that we'd identify, which is around confidentiality, and that also sort of arises from the fact that we are dealing with a population that is vulnerable, specifically given the fact that these are people who are living in urban slums, which are largely not notified, and as a result, these are people who face continuous risk of being evicted from their houses, as well as they do also face harassment from the public authorities as well. So while we were basically designing the study and also thinking about the survey instrument, one of the things that was of prime importance to us was how do we make sure that any data, any personally identifiable data that we are collecting from this project, how do we make sure that that data remains confidential, and that sort of led us to lay down strong protocols around how the data would be stored, how the data would be de-identified, and how any analysis would be done on the de-identified, and what is the level of data that we can share with the survey partner as well as with the implementation partners as well. So this is the second major risk that we had considered before we had gone for the tree review. And besides that, I guess the last major risk that we'd considered before was basically pre-specification of outcomes, just to make sure that once the results of the study are out, everyone from being the funder to the implementation partners are on the same page in terms of what are the outcomes that we are measuring as part of the impact evaluation. So these are the three major risks that we sort of considered before we had gone for the tree pilot, but things that we considered and we haven't sort of thought about, and these were things that didn't even sort of come through while we were going in while we had sort of gone for the IRB, were basically, one was majorly around the health and safety of the enumerators. So given the fact that the target population for our survey is basically based out of slums. So this is one thing that we hadn't sort of paid much attention to, and this is something that Jen and her team had basically sort of identified as something that needs further sort of care when we are basically planning for the endline and the follow-up survey. And this is the reason this all sort of came up was because the timing of the tree review basically coincided with the time when the Omicron variant of COVID was basically leading to an increase in COVID cases in Bangalore. And so I guess that was also a motivation from Jen and her team to basically ask us about what is it that we are doing about the health and safety of the enumerators. And once we were done with the review, we actually went back to our survey partner and asked them uh, to specify protocols on what their team would be basically doing around COVID safety, and what are the things that that they would bring in place if in case any of the enumerator was to basically come out as COVID positive. So I guess the review basically helped us to sort of think about these issues. The other thing that we sort of the other suggestion that came from the review process was basically around respondent fatigue, and the fact that we would be going back to the same respondents during the end line as well, given that this is a panel of households that we are basically tracking. So at the time of the review process, given that the baseline was already ongoing, there's nothing much that we could have done, but this is one thing that we definitely have taken into account, and we will be thinking about this in much more detail when we are planning for the endline survey. And we would definitely think about like streamlining our questionnaire so as to basically reduce the time that the respondents are devoting for the survey. And this is something that we've also seen from our experience from the baseline as well, given that this is an urban population. People have actually sort of there have been cases when people have refused because they have to go to work, and they've sort of also complained to the partners that they've actually sort of lost wages because of the fact that they have to spend 2-3 hours doing the survey. So I guess this is the second major sort of suggestion that came from the tree team. The third the third sort of point that came in from the tree review was around documentation of the key decisions and the processes. And this is something that we were already doing, but I guess Jen and her team sort of suggested that we do this in a more structured manner, so that even if so that we have on paper that these are the main sort of decisions that were taken and why these decisions were taken. And this is, I guess, is also important from a project management perspective as well, given that these programs usually sort of run for 2-3 years, and given the fact that there is usually attrition as well. So if in case we have new staff who's coming in, they would be able to sort of look at these sort of documentation and understand what were the key decisions and why they were made, and how sort of that affected the various components of the program. Besides besides that, in terms of how did the review basically helped us in finding out what in thinking about risk assessment and mitigation, I guess the as I said before as well, the process helped us to think about what are the risks that exist on dealing with this population in a more sort of structured manner. As I said, that we had considered some of these sort of risks already, but I guess when we had sort of interacted with Jen and her team, as well as when we had sort of filled out the questionnaire that Shaik had just sort of shared, I guess that gave us a structured sort of way to think about some of the pieces that we had sort of missed out earlier, and sort of incorporate that into the study. And also we would be now sort of in better placed when we are going at the end line to incorporate these sort of risk and ways to sort of mitigate those risks from the start as well. So I guess therein we do sort of appreciate the tree review process and the way it sort of helped us identify additional risk and how to sort of mitigate those risks. In terms of how the process basically might help us for our next study. So the major, I guess, the major contribution is basically it sort of and this is something that I feel is that this institutionalized thinking around ethics in the team. And even though we had been sort of thinking about these issues, but it sort of helped us it helped us sort of come together as a team, and also have this external sort of team, which is even though internal to 3IE, but external to the research team, sort of come and reflect on our thinking and sort of suggest things to us. So therein we did get a lot of learning, and those sort of learning has been sort of helpful in terms of thinking when we are now sort of planning for other projects as well, and even other activities within the same project as well. So I guess the review helped us sort of come on the same sort of page in terms of having improved processes, having improved protocols around how we sort of think about data storage, management, and also sharing of data as well. So I guess these were the main points that I wanted to discuss. Jen, I'll hand it back to you then.
Thanks so much for that very comprehensive review. I am a little aware of time, so I want to turn it right back over to Vidisha. And Vidisha, you were kind of a part of the same pilot period where, I mean, tree review was just barely being developed, I think, when Chandan and your teams were kind of pilot testing it. So I'd just love to hear your experience and any kind of additional or new insight you had that kind of complements Chandan's.
Yeah, I think thanks, Chandan, for echoing many of our similar experiences. I will not really dwell on that. I wanted to raise a couple of points. I mean, these are not in no particular order. A few things, of course, some of the very project-related, issues that the tree review revealed to us. And we were having the pre-review, and I think it's important to know at what point of time we were having the pre-review. We were having the pre-review after we had gotten ethics clearance here in India. And we had rolled out, I think I would say 60% of our baseline data were collected. However, given that our evaluation was would have gathered data from the same population over many rounds, qualitative and quantitative data over many rounds, it gave us the opportunity to correct what we had not addressed in the previous round. Certain things that were pointed out by the tree review, which we had not, which were not pointed out even by the ethics review, and we did have a very, we did have a pretty rigorous ethics review where I as project manager had to make a presentation to respond to all ethical questions. Even then, there were certain gaps. And these were addressed in some way by the tree review. The first question that was raised was around payments to participants, and this really made us think. Our questionnaires were required women mostly to spend time with us for almost 1.5 hours. It was and do we pay them or do we not pay them? If we pay them, how do we pay them? Is it at all ethical to pay them? Were questions that were spurred in our minds. Why was this spurred, particularly around whether or not to pay? Because we, on the one hand, we want respondents to participate in our interviews completely voluntarily. A payment dangled in front of them is an incentive. That itself reduces the diminishes the voluntary nature of sharing information. It becomes very transactional. Give me the information, I'm going to give you money. And that was really a conundrum that I as project manager faced a lot. We did not want to do that. So what were the changes? What was our response? So going back to these people, how did we go about it? One, of course, was that we decided, yes, we would pay the women who join our FGDs, and for our interviews, we would pay them for their time. What we would not do was to tell them right at the outset that they would be paid. So we would, the idea would be the way we structured our informed consent was to tell them very transparently what the process entailed, that they could skip the entire, that they may join or leave from the survey at any point of time. And once they had said yes, and then we would say, that's fine, it's great that you have agreed. For your time and to show our gratitude, we would like to give you an honorarium. So by not, so in this way, we tried to minimize the transactional nature of of payments and responses. I think that was one thing that that at least I tried, and I am going. I mean, I'm already trying that in the current round of data collection. The other point that that we really wanted to think about was power dynamics, and our projects were all in India. We are a set of India-based Indian researchers. It is easy, and we sought, ethical clearance from an Indian IRB. It kind of made us feel that we had covered, we had actually addressed many of the power dynamics questions that that are frequently raised in evaluations such as these. But not really, because once we are, after all, urban-based, urban-based English-speaking, clearly a privileged class of individuals who are going to speak or request information from women who are not at all like us, perhaps in many aspects, economically, educationally, in the entire social structure. We probably take very different. We are at probably very different ends of the spectrum. So yes, we have to understand power dynamics, and this would exist, of course, by our behavior, by having a standard operating procedure, of course, by following certain social norms. We try to bridge the distance, bridge the power dynamics that exist between us and our respondents, but it still exists. One of the things that we can do is bring that in our analysis, and this is where reflexivity comes in. Here I am, a urban English-speaking woman, clearly privileged. I have come in an aeroplane to go to. I go in a car to a field, and I speak with women who have seen none of that. My lens has to be very clear to them, and their lens towards me also has to be clear, and this has to come in the analysis and interpretation of results. So now actually we have an approach paper for our, and we actually have come up, it will be out in publication very soon, where we have laid out the evaluation approach, and reflexivity comes very prominently in the evaluation approach itself. So yeah, while so that's yet another way in which we are trying to address power dynamics, which was something that Triac pointed out very, very clearly to us. The third point that I wanted to raise was related to what were the difficulties, for us to follow some of the 3 recommendations. We do. Oh yes, before I get into that, just one last point, and this was something again that we brought in this time round after the pre-review. This was around the last point where you said about feedback loops to the participants. So while we have not really reached a stage where we have any results to present to them, but what we did, however, is that for the second round, as we went for our FGDs and our interviews, we were piloting the question. We started, of course, with piloting, So once the piloting was done, we stopped and we asked our respondents to, number one, tell us any question that is relevant to our research theme that they would like incorporated in the questionnaire. The second point, the other question, little bit of innovation that we tried was, if I had to elicit this response, how would I ask this question? How would the women who we were piloting with, how would they basically ask this question to us? And this actually gave the respondents, the participants, the project participants, to feel part of the process. Again, a small step that we have taken to just incorporate, make sure that the women's voices were also entering our evaluation tools. The last point that I want to make is around costs. That was, I think, one of the last points that Jen had in her slides around, is it worth the costs? No doubt, the tree process is very intensive, and it has to be budgeted for, no doubt. It's also very important for the donor community then to really value the costs that go into, the additional costs that go into doing a truly ethical study. So donors have to be willing to bear costs for payments. Donors have to be willing to bear costs for extensive pilots, multiple rounds of pilots. Donors have to be willing to be bear costs of getting feedback from all participants, and that is time. Time is also resources. So so I think that is one thing that is up in the air, that how much are the donors willing to bear the cost of a truly ethical study. The same thing goes even for reproducibility of studies. And there's a lot of staff effort that goes into actually building these codes and doing the replication. So there are actually significant costs associated with doing a thorough tree compliant study, and that would be a point that we may want to raise with donors in the future. Thanks. I'll stop at that.
I think that's a great point to add. I mean, I think one thing that we've thought about with this tree process is, what is the marginal cost, if any? I mean, some of this is you're trying to spread, your resources across from beginning, from the early stages and thinking early and often, instead of all the way at the end, right? And so it may feel like there are more tasks, but actually we're just spreading the tasks over time. But is that true, right? And what is the marginal cost that's being introduced by some of these actions? I think when we look at the long list of, again, best practices, what is it that we should be integrating into our work if we're trying to align with what we believe are ethical minimal standards? What are those marginal costs? And that gets us closer to understanding what I think the true cost of doing the study should be. And then are funders willing to pay for the true cost? Or are we constantly being asked, well, you need to do more, but with less, right? And what do we do with that? So I think that's a great point to bring out, because I think this is part of the conversation, and we can't do the work without the funding for it, right? I am aware of time, and I think that was great. Thank you, Badisha. I'd like to turn it over to Andrew for his experience with piloting, with introducing the tree review into his Cameroon study.
Thank you very much, Jen. As you earlier mentioned, my name is Tangang Andrew. I work with eBase Africa as research fellow and senior policy analyst. And I have the responsibility of managing the menstrual hygiene management intervention, which basically seeks to determine the extent to which we can implement the menstrual hygiene management intervention in three education priority zones in Cameroon. So what we are trying to do is actually to increase the girls' school attendance for girls of menstruation age in three education priority regions. And these regions are considered education priority regions. We're talking about the Northwest region, the Far North region, and the East region, because they have been affected by conflict. So we are reaching out to over 10,000 girls, and we are also implementing kind of a comprehensive menstrual hygiene management package, which constitutes providing safe space for the girls, providing the girls with a dignity pack, and engaging young boys on campus to break that stigma. Young boys, teachers, as well as capacity building and community engagement for communities to also support the girls. So I'll also mention that this study is actually a pilot study, as I mentioned, to determine its feasibility and scalability. And if should there be any positive results, then it could be recommended for a trial in the nearest future. So the role of eBase is actually to coordinate this project, because it is implemented by UN Women Cameroon with its partner organizations in these three regions, and it is being evaluated by the association for an organization called ASOWIP, which is based in the Northwest region actually, and it's actually a consortium. The evaluation team is a consortium that involves ASOWIP, with another partner organization in Cameroon, with other partners abroad, NATSEND, as constituting an advisory panel. So as far as the tree review is concerned, I would like to mention that the tree review came at a point when the evaluation team had already collected baseline data, and the tree review was actually commissioned by the main funder, as Education Endowment Foundation in the UK, and that was to mainly to look into the issue around security, the main security concerns that came up as a result of the project. And I must say, Jennifer and the team at 3IE actually took time to go not just looking at the security around the project, but into other very deep questions that could actually help to structure not just the design of the evaluation, but also implementation issues. So as far as the risk, the risks that were considered for the study before the tree review, of course, we looked at conflict and security, because the project is taking place in conflict area. We also talked about what Chedan and Bara already talked about, that's informed consent and assent from parents. And they also looked into confidentiality of research participants. How do we guarantee their confidentiality? And of course, how do we store data? But following the tree review and how rigorous it was, 3I actually identified some key areas, such as the psychological harm for girls who disclose their menstrual status. And of course, this was based on hard evidence of studies that have been carried out in other parts of the world. And then they also had the COVID-19 pandemic, which was actually considered, but because of the context within which we were working, it was not brought up explicitly in the study. And then the other factors that have already been mentioned by Chidan, that's the harm to the enumerators who will be due to the crisis in those regions. We also mentioned the harm to the research participants by enumerators. For example, what if the enumerators actually inflict pain of some kind on research participants? And what if the enumerators also face some sort of abuse from the research participants? And the use of video for data collection that was mentioned, but not explicitly described the essence and how we guarantee some level of confidentiality, and who is accountable, or who should certain incidents be reported to should they arise in the course of data collection. So when these issues were raised and following a deep reflection between the eBase Africa, who commissioned the study, the evaluation team, and the delivery teams, it already helped us to start structuring our reflections on what happens next, not just within the evaluation, but also with the delivery of the implementation of the evaluation. So as a result of this review, we're able to, the evaluation team was able to redesign the informed consent and the assent forms to take into consideration certain aspects that were missing. And then the evaluation team was able to update the study plan to include certain subtle aspects that were neglected, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, and to clearly explain that the enumerators and all other members of the evaluation team will adhere firmly to the COVID-19 rules in place, which has also been precised by the administrative authorities. And it helped the team to identify the persons who will be responsible to receive reports on certain incidents. eBase Africa, if it involves the evaluation team or the delivery team, and of course the principal investigator, if it concerns one particular aspect within the area where the data is being collected. And as a result of the tree review, at eBase, we are actually incorporating the tree review into our IRB, into our internal review board. And as a result, we are training staff to be able to navigate through the tree review process. And we hope that with further input and orientation from 3IE, if should anything new come up, then it could actually help to further improve the process and actually institutionalize it within a particular context. And then we also think that the tree review is going to be a working instrument for design of not just if this study goes to the trial, not just for the trial, but for all other projects at eBase. And they will also ensure that delivery and evaluation processes adhere to key orientations from the tree review, and will incorporate the tree review in all other trainings around security and every other aspect that could not just affect the delivery, but also the evaluation of the project, which means we consider the tree review as some sort of an internal review process, which can be used to critically look at every component of an evaluation, even before an evaluation team submits application for IRB or for IRBs. And we recognize that IRB will say ethical decisions can have certain undertones depending on the context. If we take the case of Cameroon, for example, the policy around data protection is quite unclear, and sometimes you can say there is actually no policy. So it becomes difficult to determine basically what the National Ethics Committee or any such institutions is basing on. Also, such committees in certain contexts can be political institutions, and at times you don't know if the people working in these institutions actually understand the undertones of or the crux of ethical decisions or ethical procedures and how rigorous these procedures should be. So yeah, I think in all, these are some of the key points that that's the experience we had with the menstrual hygiene management, the tree review and the menstrual hygiene management project. And I must say, as a result of this review too, the team at eBase and EEF were able to actually develop some very good training points that supported the security training for both the members of the delivery team and the evaluation team. And most of the issues that were raised have been readjusted, and as a result of that, the evaluation team has been able to come up with some sort of a risk register, which they use to report any risk that can come up from the field on a daily and a weekly basis. So that has really helped to help to structure the midline data collection phase. And it is also providing further orientation as the evaluation team moves to the field for inline data collection. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. It was certainly, it's a really important study, and it was complicated, I think, from a ethics review perspective, at least, you know, with us building out the tree form, but it was really interesting to work through the details with you and your team. I think dealing in a conflict setting, working with minors, dealing with sensitive data and sensitive topics, you had it all going on in your study. So thanks for sharing your experience. I know that we're getting very close to the end of the session, but I would love to give Charlotte just a few minutes to speak about her experience. Charlotte, if you don't mind, take it away, maybe 3 to 5 minutes, but we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I'll try to be short. But I think my experience was maybe a little bit different from that of other folks, because we actually did start this tree review very early on in the process. So we were able to have it at the very beginning, starting with our research questions and really with how we were framing the research that we were doing. I think that something that maybe is different than the others on this group is that because we started it out early, there was maybe more hesitancy in terms of how the tree review was applicable to us, because I think a lot of the others sort of came up against a problem and then entered into the tree review process. We were doing a very small internal evaluation that was really going to be focused on learnings for the funder implementer who wanted to evaluate their own work to make sure it went better next time. And so I think there was a lot of hesitancy and questioning about, well, why is tree really even relevant in this situation? It's the funder implementer evaluating their own work without the intention of really, making it into a something that gets widely disseminated and sharing results. So I'm not sure that there was initially a complete understanding of why tree mattered. And then as we started undertaking that tree review, I do think that that was sort of initially validated when we were looking at some of the early questions that were asking about things like pre-analysis plans and reporting templates, when we were still deciding what our research questions were. And I don't think we were quite ready for those questions yet. And so there continued to be this feeling of like, well, this isn't where we are at the moment. So it took us a little while to really get into the right mindset for the tree review. But once we did start actually sitting ourselves down and going through the questions, we identified a pretty big issue right off the bat, which was about our research questions, about asking some sensitive questions to participants. And so we realized that we had two sort of major risks that were coming from those research questions. The first was just the very fact that the funder implementer is going to be running this evaluation means that there's tricky power dynamics between the funder and the beneficiaries. And there's a real or perceived risk of retaliation. And we did not have the ability to have large sample sizes just for practical reasons. So there was no chance of de-identification. And we also weren't really set up for super high secure data management that maybe could help mitigate that in some ways. But between the two of those, we had no way to provide confidentiality and anonymity to our participants. So even if we made promises of no retaliation, we were still putting them in an uncomfortable situation at the very least. And then the other challenge that we had was that some of our questions may have reflected on illegal activities of the respondents or of others who were being discussed, and we were not positioned to deal with that. So we started off with this big long list of 20 research questions, and because of this tree review, we are going back and focusing in those research questions more on what we actually need to know in order to evaluate the program and make it more actionable, without necessarily interrogating every possible peripheral avenue of research. So we're not avoiding the hard questions. We just want to make sure that we don't ask questions that maybe are not so important and tip that risk-benefit scale in an unfavorable direction. So I had a couple of other points to touch on, but I think I'm going to wrap up with 5 minutes left. I just want to say that my big take home from this experience was that it took us a while to get into the right mindset for the tree review. But once we did, it helped us really think about our research questions and making sure that we got those right, which definitely protected us from sort of going down the wrong road and wasting time and having to circle back later on. So it was great to work with Jen and the team.
Thanks for that. I mean, I think that that's a really critical point too, is that, I mean, just like with any kind of ethics review or risk review, we're not trying to eliminate risk. We're not trying to avoid tough questions and tough evaluation questions and risk if there is risk, right? We're looking to mitigate it. And we're looking to identify when, exactly as you just said, Charlotte, that balancing isn't happening, right? Where because we're just throwing every evaluation question in the kitchen sink into our design, and we're going to just have a questionnaire that asks every question we can possibly think of because we don't know exactly what we're looking for. If that introduces risks to our our participants, we need to come back and think about that balance, right? So I really value that input because I think that was a really important point from the engagement with your group. So we have 4 minutes. I really would love if there's 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Thank you so much for being understanding. I think that the panelists, it was very engaging and great to hear from each of the panelists. So I know we went over, but hopefully the audience isn't too sore about it. But we're happy to take 1 or 2 questions if there are any. Shayak, have we seen any yet? Or are we in the clear?
I mean, we did get a few questions, and some of the panelists have already answered some. But I would like to kind of bring up one question that I think is very relevant to this discussion. And Vidisha pointed to this previously about the cost associated and how funders can do more to actually do something about like a tree review. So I wanted to ask the panelists, and Chandan actually provided his view, but give a chance to the other panelists to kind of chime in about how do we raise awareness amongst funders to actually fund something like this and take this more seriously and think about how this can be implemented in other projects where they are funding things. So, yeah.
I can jump in with my 2 cents and then love to hear from others. I mean, I think that's where
So yeah, I think we lost Jen. Okay, in the interest of
so maybe I'll just jump in check
Yeah,
with one
thanks.
thought. So I mean, from my point of view, with the discussions that we were having, I found it really hard to get the funders on board. I think the reaction very much was like, what are you talking about? We're ethical, no worries. Which is challenging. And I think that maybe the habit that we're in is waiting until there's a issue and then going and spending a lot of money to try to solve that issue instead of being proactive about it. So it may be a question of sort of trying to articulate that value proposition of let's be proactive so that we avoid these issues. And then it actually is economically efficient. And then, you know, talk in that language.
Yes, Mitigation.
I would, pitch, the need for a pre-review to donors in two ways. One is, of course, the reputational risk of being associated with with a study or with a project that has, dubious. I mean, without actually meaning it. Sometimes people make mistakes. It's not that, as Charlotte has pointed out, everybody really here is trying to do their best, but there are gray areas that one may tread, and it is better to be aware of these and point out to the huge reputational risks that are there with doing studies with shaky ethics. The other would be, of course, that the credibility of a study hinges on how ethically it is done, and whether it is reproducible, whether it really made even sense to do the study, and credibility is also directly related to evidence use. So, and I speak about this from experience that, in some other projects where the evaluation team has opened itself, to where we allowed questions to be asked to us. How we, of course, at that time we didn't really have a very thorough, pre-process like this, but somehow we allowed the funders and the key stakeholders to question us about our methods, about the very research questions. And once that we were able to relate the need for the study and socialize them with the methods and why we were doing what we were doing, there was a lot of evidence uptake from that particular project. So I would link it to a tree gives credibility. Credibility is evidence use. So I think that's kind of a line there. Yeah.
Thanks, Vidisha. Over to you, Jen.
I think we're over time. Sorry, I froze again. So thank you, Vidisha, and thank you to all the panelists. Thank you for joining. I do apologize to our participants that we went over time and didn't have as much time for Q&A as we had planned, but I hope you found it as enriching as I did. And we're also here. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email us at TREE, T-R-E-E at 3ieimpact.org. And I will, I guess, have one last pitch to everyone who's still on the line. We have issued a call for papers for a special issue in the Journal for Development Effectiveness, centered around trends in research transparency, reproducibility, and ethics. That has been launched on the 3IE website for JDEV. And we would encourage you to take a look. If you're interested in these topics and you're writing in these topics, we'd like you to consider submitting to the special issue for JDEF on these topics. So thank you so much. Have a great day.